Good afternoon and welcome to the 2016 Porter Prize event. I'm Don Burke. I'm the Dean of the Graduate School of Public Health at the University of Pittsburgh. Before I begin, you may notice that I and several of our prominent participants are wearing similar neckties and scarves that are brightly colored. Not too long ago, our Pitt Public Health computational modeling team published a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine that showed the impact of vaccines on death and disease in the United States. And we showed that over the years since we started recording infectious diseases, over 100 million cases of serious disease and death have been prevented by vaccines. Well, the paper included some heat map graphs of the incidence of disease and the impact of vaccines. And one of the persons who wrote in to the New York Times after that had been published in there and said, you know, figure 2C really looks pretty. You should probably make neckties and scarves out of it. So what we have here is when there was a lot of measles and when there wasn't much measles, and this is the introduction of the vaccine, and this is figure 2C from the New England Journal of Medicine. So we to commemorate that, for special guests and special occasions, we give out the ties and scarves too. So that's what you see. The purpose of today's event is to celebrate the Porter Prize, an award that recognizes an individual's exceptional performance in health promotion and disease prevention. The prize is named after Milton and Adrienne Porter and is awarded in recognition of an individual's exceptional performance in health promotion and disease prevention. The Pitt Graduate School of Public Health has administered and awarded the Porter Prize since 1999, but it was originally managed by the Health Education Center, which at that time was an affiliate of the Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield. I want to recognize the event sponsor, the Highmark Foundation, and Yvonne is here somewhere. Thank you very much. As well as the Jewish, some support, additional support from the Jewish Healthcare Foundation. I thought I saw Karen walk in a minute ago. There you are. Thanks, Karen. Okay, good. Also wearing your good. Perfect. I especially want to thank Lee Foster for his continued support, and Lee and his family have endowed the Porter Prize, and Lee has chaired the Porter Prize committee. The special thanks also goes out to the entire committee who are members are here today. I'll give the names of everybody on the committee: Judy Davenport, Phil Hallen, Judy Lave, Lois Michaels, Will Payne, Maya Tuttle, and Christina Wilds. And so thank you to the members of the committee for helping us make these decisions about the award of the prize. The Porter Prize recipient is Dr. Paul A. Offit. He was born in Baltimore in 1951. He earned his bachelor's degrees from Tufts University and his MD from the University of Maryland. He then came here to Pittsburgh for his internship and residency in pediatrics, so we can claim him as one of our own. He's currently the professor of pediatrics at the Perelman School of Medicine at the University of Pennsylvania, where he is the chief of the Division of Infectious Diseases, the Maurice Hilleman Professor of Vaccinology, and Director of the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. Dr. Offit has published more than 150 papers in medical and scientific journals, largely on the topic of vaccines. He is the co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine, Rototec, a vaccine against rotavirus diarrhea in infants and children that was licensed in the United States in 2006 and is currently given routinely to most children in the United States as part of the schedule recommended by the Centers for Disease Control, and to millions of children worldwide. In addition to his scientific writings, Paul is an extraordinarily prolific author of books and writes for 2 or 3 hours each morning for 7 days a week. I wish I had that determination. I've been an avid reader of his books for years. Some of the titles of some of his books, particularly his early books, were on the history of vaccines. the Qatar incident, how America's first polio vaccine led to the growing vaccine crisis, Vaccinated, one man's quest to defeat the world's deadliest diseases, which is pays homage to Maurice Hilleman, one of the probably lesser known but most important figures in the history of vaccinology in the world. And I share that opinion, and so it's a good book to read. But then he turned his attention to the anti-vaccine movement, and then more generally to the anti-science movement. From his unambiguous titles of his books, it is clear that he does not pull punches when it comes to protecting the lives of children. Some of those titles include Autism's False Prophets, Bad Science, Risky Medicine, and the Search for a Cure. Deadly Choices, How the Anti-Vaccine Movement Threatens Us All. Do You Believe in Magic? The Sense and Nonsense of Alternative Medicine. Bad Faith, When Religious Belief Undermines Modern Medicine. What these all have in common is his intent to protect children, to make sure that the lives of children are not unintentionally harmed by persons who have beliefs that are not consonant with modern scientific medicine. So the University of Pittsburgh is a Graduate School of Public Health, in collaboration with our Porter Prize Committee, is honored to publicly recognize Dr. Offit's work to promote vaccinations and effective treatments for children. Now, I'd like to introduce Valerie McDonald-Roberts, Chief of Urban Affairs Officer for the City of Pittsburgh.
Thank you, Don. It is quite an honor to be here for such a prestigious award. And I am representing Mayor William Peduto, who unfortunately could not be here today. He is in San Diego, and I'm going to read why he's in San Diego. This is really good, though, okay? We know the mayor travels, okay? I know the mayor travels, but the mayor is in San Diego for a forum with mayors competing for the United States Department of Transportation's Smart City Challenge, which will provide the winning city with more than $50 million to build technology-based systems to address transportation and transit challenges facing cities nationwide. We are a finalist. CMU is working with the city and has paid for the travel costs. But nearly 80 cities applied for the SMART Challenge in February. And he is in San Diego, awarded $100,000 to finalize the applications due in May. From 80 applications, the city of Pittsburgh is one of 6 finalists. One of 6. So it's about urban mobility and getting the monies to build smart technology and moving people throughout this region. So again, I just wanted to make sure you all knew why he's not here and why I am here.
Go, Bill.
There you go. Go, Bill. But it is an honor to be able to acknowledge the Porter Prize Day. This is the year of the bicentennial of the city of Pittsburgh, and the University of Pittsburgh and all major institutions are included. But this is our 200th birthday this year. So the fact that this is being awarded is a bicentennial also type of prize. So it's a double honor. Whereas the Porter Prize is named in honor of Milton and Adrian Porter. Milton Porter, CEO of the L.B. Foster Company, was among the first industrialists in the nation to view the workplace as a site for wellness programs. I'm not going to read everything because it's in your program. Whereas the focus of this year's Porter Prize is vaccinations for children and will be awarded on March 30th of this year. The University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public Health will award the Porter Prize to Dr. Paul Offit, its 21st recipient. Now, therefore, be it resolved that I, William Peduto, Mayor of the City of Pittsburgh, in recognition of Dr. Offit's significant efforts in disease prevention, do hereby declare March 30th, 2016, the Porter Prize Day here in our most livable city of Pittsburgh. William Peduto, Mayor. I do want to say that the mayor has emphasis on health, on children, on part of the livability of the city as part of the Bureau of Neighborhood Empowerment that he established in the mayor's office that I oversee. And many of you all, I've talked to you, know Betty Cruz, who has done Live Well Together, Healthy Together, works with Dr. Karen Hacker of the county, and it's very much so a collaborative process that we have to make sure that we have many external partners. The government is not responsible for running everything. The government is responsible for making sure that the pieces fit together and that we work together with those who are the experts, those who are in the field, and those that know what they're doing and are making positive results. So we're only a facilitator and a supporter, and that's what the mayor's vision is for this administration, is to make sure that we are there for you all to have a very livable city and to address each and every issue that makes it livable. So congratulations to Dr. Offit, and again, it is an honor to be here to celebrate this prize. Thank you. Thank you, Don.
You want to give it to him? Why don't you hand it? Get a photograph.
Thank you, Paul. Is this a photo? Is this a photo op? What is this?
Go ahead over there.
Oh, jeez. Okay.
Over on that side.
Okay.
You never look better, Bill. Good. All right, thank you. Thank you for the very fashionable Valerie McDonald Roberts. I'm now delighted to introduce Lee Foster, chairman of the L.B. Foster Company. Lee, not only has Lee and his family sponsored the Porter Prize, Lee has served as the chairman of our school's Board of Visitors. Lee has been a longtime friend and supporter of the school. And of course, you'll notice that he's wearing one of our natty vaccine neckties as well. Lee, please.
Just in case anybody missed it. Thank you, Don. It's interesting because I came to reflect about a month ago that it was 20 years since Mike Porter passed away. And he was a man of truly sparkling intelligence and irrepressible humor, which is a great combination. And he had a profound effect on several of us in the room as a mentor. I think of Lois and I think of Karen in particular. He did recognize early on, particularly from a business executive perspective, the importance of wellness in the workplace. But I think it was his engagement early on with the Health Education Center that made him realize how important this concept was, not only in the business world, but to the region and to the community in really a global sense. When my family and I decided to endow this prize, we really thought about where the proper place to place it would be. And the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public Health truly was the perfect place. I think many of us forget from time to time when we think about the meds and eds resources that we have in the Pittsburgh community. We sometimes overlook this incredible institution. It has, in many ways, more global and national recognition sometimes than it has local recognition. But the value of the research and the education of public health professionals that occurs at this school is truly remarkable, and we are very fortunate to have this as a resource in the community, and we are very proud to be associated with it and have endowed the Porter Prize as part of the University of Pittsburgh. Having said that, and I think you have all heard about the many accomplishments of Dr. Offit, so it's really, rather than repeat it, I think we're all anxious to hear what he has to say, but it is truly my honor and my pleasure to present him with the 2016 Porter Prize.
First of all, thank you so much. It's an emotional day for me. I got up early this morning and walked around the area around 5th and DeSoto where I trained. It's a hole there now. It was a hospital then, and it definitely shaped me. I mean, I learned how to be a doctor there, and there's another thing that happened to me there that I had never seen before, and that ended up being a motivation for me really throughout the next 30 years during the time that we developed the bovine human reassortant rotavirus vaccine, Rototec, which was when I was a second-year resident. There was a child who came in, 9-month-old girl, who had rotavirus-induced fever and vomiting for really just about a day. And, you know, she'd done what the doctor had told her to do. She tried to take, you know, frequent sips of fluids containing sugar and minerals, but was unable to hold anything down because she was vomiting so much. And she was severely dehydrated by the time she got to the emergency department, even though it had been less than a day's worth of illness. And we tried to put in intravenous lines into her arms and legs unsuccessfully. We called the surgeon to come down and put a cut down into her neck to try and get a intravenous line into her neck, but she was that dehydrated. And so we did something I'd never seen before, which is we took a bone marrow needle and drilled it into her bone, trying to get fluid into her bone marrow so that that would then be resorbed, so that it would try and stave off the shock that was killing her. And it was too late. I mean, she was overwhelmed by that disease and died. And then what happens as a resident is you do the thing that's hardest for you to do, which is you then walk outside of that treatment room and you can tell the mother that her previously healthy 9-month-old was dead. And that image was always in my head whenever, you know, for the 26 years that it took us to create that vaccine. So Pittsburgh made me. So thank you. All right. So to get this, let's see. Okay, good. Oops. Let's see. Close this. This looks promising. Okay, so I want to talk about vaccines today, specifically that more parents are choosing not to vaccinate their children. The CDC's most recent estimates are that about 1% to 2% of parents choose not to vaccinate their children at all. About 10 to 20% choose to delay, withhold, space out, or separate vaccines. And as a consequence, there have been outbreaks of vaccine-preventable diseases. Most notably, last year, you saw an outbreak of measles that started around Disneyland, that spread down to 25 other states involving about 180 people. It spread also into 2 Canadian provinces involving hundreds of more children. The year before that, there were 680 cases of measles. So that's what happens when you choose not to vaccinate. And parents are making this choice because they can. There are 3 ways in which you can choose not to vaccinate. One is you have a medical exemption, which is to say there's a component of the vaccine to which you might be allergic. Obviously, you wouldn't have to get that vaccine. All 50 states have medical exemptions. I'm not going to talk about them today. I want to talk about the 2 other reasons people choose not to get vaccines, which are non-medical exemptions, specifically religious and philosophical exemptions. 47 states have religious exemptions, and 17 states now have philosophical exemptions. This Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has both. So I'm going to start with religious exemptions because they're the most common, at least the most common exemption, in that they exist in 47 states. And for those of you who are young, never talk about religion in public. It's only a loser. You will only aggravate people. But, you know, I'll be on a plane by 5:30, so I'm good. So I'm going to argue that religious exemptions don't make sense from the standpoint of biblical scripture, constitutional law, or religious morality. Starting with scripture, the first vaccine was Edward Jenner's vaccine. It was made in 1796, the smallpox vaccine. The Old Testament was written between 1400 and 400 BC, never mentions vaccines or predicts their existence. Similarly, the Old Testament and Quran were written millennia before the smallpox vaccine was invented. Now, in addition, religious leaders really from all the major religions have continued to support vaccines. Probably the best example is that there are several vaccines, 3 vaccines actually, that are given to infants and young children that were derived from elective abortions that were performed in the early 1960s, either in England or in Sweden. And there have been Catholics, obviously, who were upset about this, who then took this to the Pontifical Academy for Life, which is the major policy-making body of the Vatican. And Joseph Ratzinger was the head of that at the time, became Pope Benedict XVI. And ruled that despite that those who give vaccines and those who get vaccines are not violating church law. So I think the church, as well as other major religions, have been very good, actually, about supporting vaccines. Regarding constitutional law, the First Amendment of the Constitution says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. But there are 3 examples where this country prohibits the free exercise of religion. 1, If you are a fundamentalist Mormon, went to the Supreme Court in the 1860s, you are not allowed to practice polygamy. Even though there are groups in Utah where that is true, technically it is not legal. If you're a Jehovah's Witness and you believe that there are two lines, one in Acts, one in Leviticus, that basically says, I shall not eat the blood of birds or mammals, and you take that to mean that you shouldn't get a blood transfusion, an event that happened roughly 1,800 years after those two lines were written, you can choose not to get a blood transfusion for yourself as an adult. But if you are a child less than the age of consent, and you come to the hospital and you need a life-saving blood transfusion, we can get a court order to make that child a ward of the state and give them a life-saving blood transfusion. This has gone to the United States Supreme Court twice, and in both cases, the ruling was in favor, frankly, as far as I'm concerned, for the children. Thirdly, if you're a member, this probably is the most recent of the three. This was the Native American Church in Oregon, as part of their religious ritual, in order to get closer to the Creator, smokes peyote. Peyote contains mescaline. Mescaline is a Schedule I drug. That violated local drug laws. So this also worked its way up to the United States Supreme Court, a clash between a religious practice, smoking peyote, and a local drug law. The local drug law won, which is probably good in the sense that I think there would have been a lot of new religions sprouting up on the basis of various drugs, but that's the way that played out. So the next question is, do United States citizens have a constitutional right to exempt themselves from vaccines? The answer to that question has been gone to the Supreme Court twice. The first and probably the most famous case was the case of Jacobson v. Massachusetts. Henning Jacobson was a Lutheran minister during a smallpox epidemic in Cambridge, Massachusetts. At the time, the Cambridge Board of Health stated that you either had to get a smallpox vaccine or pay a $5 fine. Henning Jacobson refused both. That went to a local court, to a state Supreme Court, and ultimately to the United States Supreme Court. Jacobson believed that God would reward him for his faithfulness, that he didn't need to get a smallpox vaccine. That went to the U.S. Supreme Court, where, writing for the majority, Justice John Marshall Harlan said, quote, "The liberty secured by the Constitution of the United States does not import an absolute right to be wholly freed from restraint. There are manifold restraints to which every person is necessarily subject for the common good. Society based on the rule that each one is the law unto himself would soon be confronted with anarchy and disorder." Now, this went to the U.S. Supreme Court one more time. It was 17 years later. It was in the case of a high school student named Rosalind Zucht, who also chose not to get a smallpox vaccine, which was required for school entry, and so she was expelled from her school. This also went to the U.S. Supreme Court, where they unanimously supported the Jacobson ruling. The difference in this case was there wasn't a smallpox epidemic at the time in San Antonio, Texas, yet still the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the right to compel one to be vaccinated. Now, there's another case. This is probably the most cited public health case around, even though it had nothing to do with vaccines. The ruling actually did say something about vaccines, so I want to go through it. It was the story of Sarah Prince, who was a Jehovah's Witness, who wanted to distribute Jehovah's Witness pamphlets on the streets of Brockton, Massachusetts at night, and she wanted her young niece to do it with her. That violated local child labor laws. You can't have a young girl standing on the streets of Massachusetts at night handing out pamphlets. That was felt to put her in an unsafe position. So that was the clash, sort of right to practice religion freely versus local child labor laws. That too worked its way up to the United States Supreme Court, where Sarah Prince lost. But the ruling, which is my favorite because it has my favorite line in it, is this one. Quote, "A parent cannot claim freedom from compulsory vaccination for the child any more than for himself on religious grounds. The right to practice religion freely does not include the liberty to expose the community to infectious disease. Parents may be free to become martyrs themselves, but it does not follow that they are free to make martyrs of their children." Now, although there's no constitutional right to refuse vaccines, states may allow exemptions. Now, initially, there were a number of cases in the 60s and 70s and even early 80s that went to the state Supreme Court where the parents said, it is my choice in my religion not to get a vaccine. And these cases all lost. Basically, the claim was, you're not being discriminated against on the basis of your religion because all religions are being asked to be vaccinated. But in Albany on June 20th, 1966, a door opened up, once again showing that bad things come from New York. I'm sorry. I mean, as a Philadelphian, I now am a Philadelphia Eagles season ticket holder, so the Giants, certainly, you know what I'm talking about. All right, so we'll just... In any case, New York State was considering a bill requiring polio vaccine for school entry, a bill that passed by 150 to 2. But there were two dissenting votes, both Republicans, both from Long Island, because the bill excluded parents whose religion forbade vaccination. This was the direct results of the lobbying effort of a particular religious group whose major text of the religion actually does state not to be vaccinated. It's a religion, therefore, that would have had to have been founded after 1796. And can any students in this room, because I see there are a few of you, name this religion? So it's Scientology, which is a religion for God knows what reason. But no, that's sorry for the Scientologists in the crowd. You're close, but it's not Scientology. But you're very close. Christian Science, very good, right. So Christian Science was founded by Mary Baker Eddy in 1875 with the publication Science and Health with a Key to the Scripture. Mary Baker Eddy believed that illness was a spiritual, not a physical disorder, that diseases should be treated with prayer, not medicines or surgeries. As she states in this text, quote, "We have smallpox because others have it, but mortal mind, not matter, contains and carries the infection." Basically, Mary Baker Eddy's thinking was God is perfect, God creates man in his image, therefore man is perfect. So, for example, if you see a boil on the back of your hand, that boil doesn't exist. It can't exist because you're perfect. So what you need to do is just get closer to God through prayer or closer to God through supplication. And with that, the boil goes away because it never really existed in the first place. It's a hard-working religion, Christian Science. Just you're being asked to deny, frankly, a reality in front of you. But in the late 1800s, this was the most popular religion. This was the fastest-growing religion because, frankly, what did you really have to offer in 1875 in medicine? I mean, you had ether and chloroform as a general anesthetic agent. You had quinine, cinchona bark for malaria, but that was about it. I mean, you didn't have an anti-seizure med. Phenobarbital didn't exist till 1910. You didn't have really a broad-spectrum antibiotic till the sulfa drugs came in the 1930s. So the aphorism at the time was that that old doctors let you die and young doctors do things to kill you. It's probably pretty much true. There was cathartics and emetics and leeches and scarifications. And what she did was she put into the hands, I think, of the common man the power to heal, which at the time, was an issue. So you can get the same thing at the GNC Center today, but that was then. So what happened was what you would expect to have happened. It occurred at the Daycroft School in Greenwich, Connecticut, a Christian Science school, where an outbreak of polio occurred that paralyzed 11 children in a school of 128. Typically, polio is an asymptomatic infection. Only about 1 in 200 who are infected or paralyzed. So you can assume probably everybody in that school was infected with polio. At the time of the outbreak, there hadn't been a single case of polio in Connecticut for more than 3 years. Polio didn't spread to the surrounding community because the surrounding community, fortunately, was vaccinated. But there was a letter to the editor written to the New England Journal of Medicine at the time from a public health official that was involved with this Daycroft School outbreak. Quote, "I am deeply bothered that disease prevention measures of documented benefit can be withheld by their parents in the name of religious freedoms, jeopardizing the health of the community as well. The courts of this land have long since set precedent in the protection of children from the irresponsible acts of their parents." But that opened a door through which William Meyer walked. He basically said, I am being discriminated. Here you have this law in New York, and I'm being discriminated against because I'm not a Christian Scientist. And that opened a door through which now essentially 47 states have walked. Now, interestingly, the 3 states that don't allow religious exemptions are Mississippi, West Virginia, and California. I mean, Mississippi is not one you necessarily would have picked, but they don't allow religious exemptions to vaccination because its Supreme Court ruled that they were unconstitutional in what was called the Brown v. Stone decision. This is my favorite decision. I mean, they basically bounced the First Amendment with the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. So the 14th Amendment states there's 2 clauses, the second of which is relevant here. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, the due process clause, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws, which is to say that all people, including children, deserve equal protection under the law. So parents don't own their children. There's no reason why children whose parents are members of a religion that doesn't embrace good medical care should be afforded less protection than other children. That was their ruling. So I think Mississippi essentially defended the civil rights of its children to have a life free of vaccine-preventable illnesses. There's another case. I want to mention this because it's relevant to the 14th Amendment. This was a case of a faith healing child, a child who was whose parents were faith healers. I'm going to get to faith healing in a second, but the child had bacterial pericarditis. So the pericardium is a membrane that surrounds the heart. There can be bacteria that can grow there underneath the pericardium and cause severe inflammation, which can cause death, which is what happened in this 5-year-old boy. The parents chose prayer instead of antibiotics for his bacterial pericarditis. He died, and as a consequence, the parents were forced to send their other children to foster care, and they were imprisoned. Now, this worked its way up to the state Supreme Court, where the ruling was in favor, basically, of the choice to find those parents guilty of a criminal activity. Quote, "Why should children not be afforded special protection by our laws, each child on an equal basis with every other child, where the denial of that protection may injure or cripple the child for life? Equal protection should not be denied to innocent babies, whether under the label of religious freedom or otherwise." There are many people, and me among them, who have been working very hard to try and get a faith healing case to go to the United States Supreme Court, because there are 20 sects in this country that practice faith healing, 2 big ones in our city, which I'll get to in a second, but they have just resisted. And so we don't have that precedent, which I think is too bad, because the Supreme Court has just chosen not to take on faith healing, i.e. religion, at least to date. Okay, so now we'll get to religious morality. In order to talk about that, I want to talk about an outbreak of measles that occurred in our city in 1991. It started on April 20th, 1989 in the Spectrum in Philadelphia, where after returning from a trip to Spain, a teenager with a blotchy rash attends an REM concert at the Spectrum in Philadelphia. REM was a rock group. Ask your parents about it. A couple weeks later, several other teenagers get sick. Measles virus has now entered our city. Now, on May 21st, 1990, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and you would assume from this somewhat comical title that measles is really not a big deal. But it is a big deal, because prior to the measles vaccine being introduced in this country in 1963, every year measles caused 3 million cases, 48,000 hospitalizations, and about 500 deaths. Almost everyone was infected by 15 years of age. And deaths typically were caused by either pneumonia, encephalitis, which is inflammation of the brain, or dehydration. Now, by November 29, 1990, in our city, 96 Philadelphia children were infected with measles. By December 7th, that number increases to 124. By December 31st, that number increases to 258. And in December 1990, an 18-month-old boy dies from measles pneumonia. That's the first measles death in our city in 20 years. Keep these numbers in mind as we go through this story, because remember, last year's measles epidemic, the 2015 measles epidemic, involved about 180 children, about a quarter of whom were hospitalized, none of whom died from that particular epidemic. Compare that, and this was in the news every day. I mean, compare that to what you're about to hear in Philadelphia. And this is 1991. This is 30 years into the development of a measles vaccine. On January 12, 1991, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer as another child dies. Both measles deaths occurred in unimmunized children. The Philadelphia Health Commissioner recommends that the first dose of vaccine should be given at 6 months of age. 7 weeks later, city health officials will do something that has never been done before and never been done since. The health commissioner was Robert Ross, who actually trained at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine. He is now the CEO of a philanthropic organization in Northern California. On January 16th, he receives an anonymous phone call from a woman whose daughter belongs to the Faith Tabernacle Church in North Philadelphia. The woman warns Ross that church members don't believe in medical care. Quote, "No one had died yet," said Ross, "but for the first time we worried that we might not hear about a case of measles until a church member calls the police or calls the coroner to pick up the body." Now, the Faith Tabernacle Church's doctrine instructs members to, quote, "believe that the Bible is opposed to all means of healing apart from God's way." Quote, "If I go to God and ask him to heal my body," says church member Gordon Korn, "I can't go to a doctor for medicine. You either trust God or you trust man." The church school contains hundreds of children, none of whom are immunized. This is a modern-day picture of the Faith Tabernacle Church. Still, it's, for those of you who know Philadelphia, it's in North Philadelphia at 5th and Erie, and it's still a large, thriving church with a large school. Of children who are unvaccinated. On February 11th, 1991, this headline appears in the Inquirer as 2 more children die. On February 7th, Karen Still, a 9-year-old girl, is pronounced dead from measles. On February 10th, Monica Johnson, a classmate, is also pronounced dead. Monica is one of 11 children in the home, all of whom are unimmunized. Monica's father is a teacher at the school. Quote, I feel very confident in my belief in the way I've raised my children, he says. Monica is something that God has given us and now has taken away. On February 12, 1991, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer as the city of Philadelphia takes the first of what are 4 legal steps to try and deal with this growing epidemic. What Bob is able to do is obtain a court order to visit the families who refuse to let him touch their children. What we were allowed to do is you were allowed to go into the home by law, and you were allowed to look at the child from a distance, but you were not allowed to examine the child. You could look to see whether they were evidently dehydrated, evidently struggling to breathe because they had pneumonia, but you couldn't examine them. Quote, most of the families had 6, 8, 10, 12 kids because they didn't believe in birth control, says Ross. There were also a lot of kids who were physically or mentally disabled because they all had in-house deliveries. Even if the kids were born breech, they didn't do a cesarean section. It was like the old days. Ross finds that the children appear well. Quote, these kids had the rash, they were lying in bed, but they were alert, conversant, and appeared well hydrated. He pleads with the parents to let him know if their children get any sicker, which is what we all do. I mean, we depend on parents to let us know when their children are sick. We can't examine them every day to make sure that they're healthy. On February 15th, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Another child dies. On the day before, police are called to the home of Lynette Milnes, who's pronounced dead. Milnes doesn't attend the Faith Tabernacle School, but her sister does. Lynette's 7 brothers and sisters are all unimmunized. Quote, when another kid turned up at the morgue, I checked my list and realized she was on it, said Ross. I had just called the mother and she told me her kids were fine. She lied to me. So Ross now realizes that the information he's getting from parents is inaccurate, so he gets a court order to physically examine the child. This is the second legal step. He enlists residents at both our hospital, Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and St. Christopher's Hospital, the other major children's hospital in the city of Philadelphia, to go door to door. Quote, it was one of the more inspiring moments in my 30 years in healthcare, says Ross. These were busy people on call every third night, yet they were happy to do it. On February 16th, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Daily News as 2 more children die. In the early morning of February 15th, Nancy Evans, a 5-year-old from north central Philadelphia, dies from measles. She doesn't belong to the Faith Tabernacle Church. Rather, she belongs to the First Century Gospel Church, another major faith-healing church in our city. Also on February 15th, Tina Louise Johnson, the 13-year-old sister of Monica Johnson, dies on the day of Monica's funeral. Neither Nancy Evans nor Tina Louise Johnson were taken to the doctor when their illnesses worsened. So, 5 children have now died in 10 days. Philadelphia is in the midst of the single worst measles epidemic in the United States. Typically in the U.S., about 1 in 1,000 infected children will die from measles. In some developing world countries, that figure can reach as high as 1 in 300. But in Philadelphia, 4 of 150 children with measles who attend the Faith Tabernacle Church are dead. That's a mortality rate of 1 in 35, worse than in any developing world country. So the CDC sends a team to investigate what's happening in the city of Philadelphia. The head of that team was a guy named Bill Atkinson. The question he was charged with answering was there something unique about the strain of Philadelphia in our city? Was it more virulent than strains that were circulating in other cities or across the country? But what Atkinson finds is that these deaths have nothing to do with the strain and everything to do with the parents who were choosing basically not to seek medical care for children who had dehydration or pneumonia. On February 21st, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer. Philadelphia measles epidemic is now at its peak. At CHOP, 82 children have been seen in the emergency department and 28 have been hospitalized. When the dust settled, those numbers were 200 who were seen in the ED and about 40 who were hospitalized. At St. Chris's, 250 children have been seen in the emergency department and 3 are being hospitalized every week. Ross and his team have visited now 80 families and 500 children. This, by the way, is no way to run a healthcare system, but predicts, quote, accurately, there will be more measles deaths in the city of Philadelphia. On February 18th, this headline appears in the Inquirer as we take now the next step. Ross now asks the mayor to obtain a court order to hospitalize children who are critically ill against the parents' will. With the telephone number of a judge in hand, the residents examined children from the Faith Tabernacle Church. Quote, it was like entering a time warp, said Mark Jaffe, who headed the St. Chris's team. With the exception of the fact that they all stay home and watch their children die from measles, they seem like wonderful people. So 2 children are hospitalized. One is Daniel Kern, a 4-year-old who develops measles pneumonia. The healthcare worker insists on admitting the child to the hospital. The parents, quote, politely but firmly refuse. Ross calls city solicitor Sharice Lilly, who calls family court judge Edward Summers, who gets an emergency order to hospitalize the boy. And then a second child, a 1-year-old Bianca Carpina, is also hospitalized against her parents' will. On February 28, 1991, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer as we now take the fourth and about to take the fourth and final step. Our city is now a feared destination. 2 nearby schools cancel trips to the city. The city prints 50,000 educational pamphlets and is vaccinating hundreds of school children every week. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania sends $100,000 in federal funds to help. And on February 27, 1991, Mayor Wilson Goode asked the city solicitor's office to obtain a court order to forcibly vaccinate children against their parents' will. Now, I want to make a legal distinction here. There's a distinction between a mandatory vaccine and a compulsory vaccine. A mandatory vaccine is you were asked to get a vaccine. If you don't get a vaccine, then you may not be able to work at the hospital you want to work at. You may not be able to go to the school you want to go to. In the case of Henning Jacobson, you may have to pay a fine. A compulsory vaccine is you are pinned down and vaccinated, in this case, whether your parent wants you to be vaccinated or not. That has never happened before in this country, and to my knowledge, this is the only time it has ever happened. But that is what we wanted to do here. Now, what happened was the pastor of the Faith Tabernacle Church, Charles Reinert, believed that his rights were being violated, and they were. I mean, we had a religious exemption to vaccination on the books for 10 years in our city. What he was doing by choosing not to vaccinate those children was perfectly within the bounds of the law. And so what he did was he sought out exactly who you would expect him to seek out to represent him was the American Civil Liberties Union. Now, this is a group that has been willing to represent very unpopular causes, both before and since this particular incident. I'll go through a few of them. The ACLU was willing to represent the Dove World Outreach Center when they wanted to have their children wear to high school these shirts, which say Islam is of the devil, including a high school that had Muslim children there. They represented the Westboro Baptist Church. This was a church that believed that homosexuality was a sin, that Americans were being punished for that sin by having soldiers die in wars, and so they often go to funerals, for example, in this case, for soldiers who had died, for example, in the war in Iraq, protesting those funerals, holding up signs like that, wearing the URL from their website, godhatesfags.com. And most famously, they represented in 1977 the desire of neo-Nazis to march down the streets of Skokie, Illinois. Skokie is a suburb of Chicago, home to many Jews, and frankly, in 1977, home to many Jewish Holocaust survivors. And they represented their desire to do that. Actually, there's an online humor magazine called The Onion, which had a headline that I thought was perfect representing this. It was something like, ACLU represents neo-Nazis' desire to burn down ACLU headquarters. So, on March 2nd, 1991, this headline appears in the Philadelphia Inquirer as the ACLU declines to help parents in the measles case. Deborah Levy, who represented this group, says, quote, there is certainly a free exercise of religion claimed by the parents, she said. She represented the Philadelphia chapter of the ACLU. But there is also a competing claim that parents don't have the right to martyr their children, thus sounding that line from the 1944 Prince v. Massachusetts ruling. I don't think we've walked away from our principles here. You know, this probably seems amazing in retrospect, but you had to be there. If you were in the city of Philadelphia at the time, this was beyond an unpopular cause, trying to represent those parents' desire not to vaccinate those children. So on March 9th, 1991, 5 children get court-ordered vaccinations. When Bill Atkinson published his paper, he found that among church members, 486 people were infected and 6 died. Among non-church members, 938 people were infected and 3 died. That's 1,400 cases and 9 deaths in one city in a several-month period. All 9 deaths were in children. The attack rate in church members was about 1,000-fold greater than the surrounding community. In 2013, the CDC identifies about 30,000 children whose parents have chosen not to vaccinate them for religious reasons. Given the underreporting and the insular nature of some faith healing groups, that number is likely much larger. And if you take a state like New York, for example, they don't have a philosophical exemption. They have a religious exemption, which is often the choice there. Okay, I'm going to probably regret this slide, but I'm going to try anyway. Remember, on the plane by 5:30. we see a lot of medical neglect in our hospitals, I'm sure happens here. When we see medical neglect, it's invariably because the parent is in an impoverished circumstance. The children fall through the cracks, unloved, uncared for. Usually their hygiene is poor, and that's what we see. But that wasn't these parents. I mean, these homes were immaculate. These were generally middle-class to upper-middle-class parents. The children were well cared for. And when they came to our hospital, it sort of gave me the chance to ask the question, how could you do this? I mean, how could you trump basically your most primal instinct, which is to protect your child? I think, if you're given the choice of take your own life or take your child's life, you will give up your own life every time. And yet, here, these parents stood back. And every one of them, when I asked that question, always had the same answer. We were treating our child. We were praying. Jesus was our doctor. So this story is what compelled me to write the book, Bad Faith, because I needed to exorcise the demons, if you will, that came from dealing with this outbreak. And when I first wrote the book, I'm not, just full disclosure, not a religious person, but I thought I would take the point of view that is taken by people like Christopher Hitchens or Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins, that religion can be illogical and potentially harmful. But I thought, in fairness, what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the New Testament. I'm going to, as a scientist would read it, which is to say, where's the evidence? If you're saying this is something that reasonably would be done by Jesus, then let's see if we can read through the New Testament and find evidence for that. And here's what I would conclude. Independent of whether you believe in the existence of a supreme being, or independent of whether you believe that Jesus is a deity, i.e. the Son of God, or independent of whether you believe that the four Gospels, at least the four Gospels that made it into the final canon, were an accurate representation of things that Jesus said or did. Even if you take those stories as allegory, you have to be impressed by the figure described as Jesus of Nazareth. I mean, at the time of his life, which was roughly 4 BC to 30 AD, and Mark was written only 30 years after his death, child abuse was the crying vice of the Roman Empire. Abandonment was common, infanticide was common, foundation sacrifices were common, which is to say you take a child less than 2 years of age, kill them, put them in a jar, bury them into a foundation of a building for good luck. If you look at some small towns in the Roman Empire, the ratio of boys to girls is 2 to 1. That's not nature's way. The reason that happened would be the woman would give birth in a pit. If it was a boy, the boy would be carried out. If it was a girl, the girl would remain and be buried. I mean, children didn't matter. Children were property. They were no different than slaves. That's the time in which Jesus was living. And yet if you listen to or read what is written in the scriptures, what he says is he actually cares about children. I mean, suffer me the children, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. He believed they had souls, therefore, because they were human, and therefore they could go to heaven. He always makes time for children. There's many passages where it's surprising to the writer that he makes time for children. And my favorite line, which was Matthew 25:40, was, verily I say unto you, inasmuch as you have done it unto one of the least of my brethren, you have done unto me. I mean, I think you could emblazon that onto the entranceway of every children's hospital in the world. So I don't get it. And I didn't get it then. And what really upset me and us at that time was, where the hell was the church? And it's not like they weren't approached. I mean, both the Catholic Church, and it was Anthony Bevilacqua, had just been elevated from bishop to cardinal. He was a major voice in our city, as well as several Protestant denominations. And no one stood up and said, this isn't us. This is not a Christian thing to do, because it's not. And that was actually the most disappointing thing for me living through that at the time. Okay, so I'll close this. I have about, how many more minutes do I have, do you think? How many? Just a couple. Okay, well then I'll just move it along. So this is sort of my take home from this, but I'll skip, since I just have a couple, I'll skip to the punchline. No, okay, hold it. Okay, hold it. Okay, thank you. Be popular to me. Okay. So just briefly to touch on philosophical exemptions, then you'll get the punchline. I think that 15 years after the Mayer decision, Lou Levy said basically to us, religion is not a temple, it's not something outside of ourselves, and making a point that there's a blurry line between religion and philosophy. The judge agreed, granting vaccine exemptions if beliefs were held with the strength of religious convictions. That should actually read 17 states now have philosophical exemptions. I do have a problem with the terms. Phila, love, sophos, wisdom, right? Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, except that, Eagles games. But, you know, I don't, I mean, it's, where is the wisdom that says it's better not to get a vaccine than get one? I just don't think that term is right. Similarly, a personal belief exemption, vaccines aren't a belief system. They're an evidence-based system, and they stand on a mountain of evidence. There's a book that's the senior editor of which is Stan Plotkin. It's called Vaccines. It's about 1,600 pages long. It's got 20,000 references in it. Read the book, read the references. You'll see that you don't have to believe in vaccines any more than you have to believe in gravity or believe in evolution. These are fact-based systems. So call these what they are. I mean, they're a, you know, I don't really see these diseases anymore. You know, so I've read a lot of scary things about vaccines. Jenny McCarthy is my healthcare guru. Exemption. Call it that, because that's a little closer to what this really is. Okay, I'm going to conclude with just the last few slides, because I think there was a breakthrough moment in California just in the last few months when they passed Senate Bill number 277 to basically eliminate philosophical exemptions. The brave legislator who stood up here, and I think there are few brave legislators. Richard Pan. Is he? Okay, all right. So he's a pediatrician, is Richard Pan. He's a Democrat in California, and he took it upon himself to overturn this bill, and believe me, there is a personal price to be paid for this. I mean, his house was spray painted, his life was threatened, he had to get bodyguards, he was almost subject to a recall election. But he stood tall. I just think there are so few profiles and courage in the legislature these days. Maybe you disagree, but that was not him. He really took the hits that did what needed to be done. And what turned the day was this child here on the left. This was a boy who participated in a number of these hearings. He's a 6-year-old who had leukemia, who was in the induction phase of his therapy, and he said, I can't be vaccinated. I depend on those around me to protect me. What about me? And that really helped turn the day. Now, those who oppose vaccines, not surprisingly, were very angry about this. This is just one of the banners that they had, and this is an example of what you saw at the State House. You know, panicking as in Richard Pan, panicking over measles. Get real. Where is the panic over 1 in 68 with autism? No on Senate Bill 277. You know, I agree with this woman. If vaccines caused autism, of course they shouldn't be mandated. But vaccines don't cause autism, so really what she's worried about is not a reason not to get vaccines. They also don't cause a lot of other things they're blamed to cause, like multiple sclerosis or diabetes, or hyperactivity, or attention deficit disorder, or mad cow disease, or ovarian failure, or whatever. They don't cause any of those things, which is not to say they don't have side effects, but this is not one of them. So in any case, my last slide is this one. I think that there are vaccine safety activists. To me, John Salomon was a vaccine safety activist. He was a father of a boy who got polio from the oral polio vaccine. Now, this was a rare event. It occurred only in 1 per 2.4 million doses, but it was real, and we eliminated polio from this country by the late 70s, such that by the only polio we saw was polio caused by the polio vaccine. He argued, I'd rather have the inactivated vaccine, which we weren't giving at that time. At least let me know about that. I mean, don't put a black box warning on this. And I was actually on the polio working group to the CDC that moved us from the oral polio vaccine to the inactivated polio vaccine, and I brought him onto that group. And there was resistance, but to me, he's an example of a vaccine safety activist. So the last point I want to make is I'd like to think that what happened in California sort of represents a new norm for children's rights, their right to equal protection under the law, because the question is, who represents them? You know, if you're an African American and you feel you're treated badly, there are groups you can go to who will represent you. Or if you're a woman and you feel you're a victim of gender discrimination, there are groups who will represent you. Or if you're Jewish and you feel you're being defamed, there are groups who will represent you. But when you're a child, it's assumed that your parents represent your best interests. But what happens when they don't? What happens then? And I think then it's reasonable for the state, through Parents Patriae, to represent those interests. And I think sometimes people just have to be compelled to do the right thing, as they're compelled to get car seats. You know, Chris Christie, said, that he thinks it's a parent's right to choose whether to be vaccinated, which is ironic given that he lives in a state that has a car seat law. It's the click it or ticket law. If your child's of a certain weight and age and they're not in a car seat, you get a ticket. There's not a religious exemption to car seats. There's not a philosophical exemption to car seats, because car seats save lives just like vaccines do. So, yeah, just to make the last point, just to choose Mississippi again, you could have gone down to Mississippi in the 1950s and talked all you want to educate people about how African Americans and Caucasians are all members of the same race, the human race, and should all be treated, with compassion and respect and consideration. And you would have convinced, there was a lot of people you wouldn't have convinced. And so what you did was you created laws and enforced those laws for integration, and such that a few years ago, the head of the student union at the University of Mississippi was an African-American woman. I don't think you ever would have envisioned that 50 years ago, but ultimately people were compelled to do the right thing, creating a new norm, and I think that could happen here too. So thanks a lot, and I'll take your questions.
Thank you very much. So now we're going to have a moderated discussion. Our moderator will be Paul Guggenheim from WESA, a radio host. And so Paul and Paul, if you want to go up there and sit, we'll have a discussion for a bit, and then we'll take some questions from the audience as well.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody. This is a really tough act to follow. I think, Paul Offit doesn't need anybody to prompt him on how to speak about this issue. It is great to see such a fine turnout for Paul Offit, a very fitting and deserving winner of the Porter Prize for his tireless work in disease prevention. Dr. Offit certainly considered to be one of the heroes and the leaders of the public discussion on how vaccines save lives. And we discovered during the luncheon today that Paul and I have a very strong mutual interest in sports. So, when there's a championship game and somebody wins and they go down to the field to the interviewer, what is the first thing that the interviewer asks the victorious subject? Paul, how does it feel to win the Porter Prize?
I'm going to go to Disney World.
They paid him to say that. No, they didn't. Go ahead.
It feels. Thank you very much. I'm humbled by this. Obviously, it's very, very kind. I looked at the previous winners; they're way out of my league. So, thank you.
There are different vaccine exemptions, and you covered them certainly very well, especially the religious, the philosophical exemption might have gotten a little shortchanged there. What is the philosophy that allows for the philosophical exemption? What exactly, you may not agree with it, but you can understand people feeling strongly about their religion and buying into the idea that, we'll let God decide what happens to my children. But what's this philosophical thing?
Okay, so the cynical answer would be it's a Nietzsche-esque philosophy, which is that which doesn't kill me makes me stronger. But I won't answer it cynically. I think it's just it's really not. It's a sentiment, which is to say that people just aren't scared of the disease. That's really what it boils down to. We ask children or parents in this country to give 14 different vaccines in the first few years of life, which can mean as many as 26 inoculations during that time. It can mean as many as 5 shots at one time to prevent diseases that most people don't see, using biological fluids that most people don't understand. You didn't have to convince my parents to be vaccinated. They were children of the 20s and 30s. They saw diphtheria as a common killer of teenagers. They saw polio as a common cause of paralysis. I'm a child of the 50s and 60s. I had measles, I had mumps, I had rubella, I had varicella. I remember what those felt like. But my children who were 23 and 21,
not only don't see these diseases today, they didn't grow up with them. For them, it's all a matter of faith. They don't know what we're talking about. All those pictures of infectious disease are in black and white. It's also this sort of, it's not really the philosophy, I guess, would be an embracing of nature would be, I guess, the nicest way to say it. But I have no idea why nature has such a good publicity agent. Mother Nature can kill you and does. We have fought back against Mother Nature for millennia, right? It's why we have vaccines, why we have antibiotics, it's why we have sanitation programs, it's why we live longer. I said this on your radio show yesterday, but there's a New Yorker cartoon with two cavemen sitting around a campfire, and one says to the other, I don't get it. Our air's pure, our water's clean, all our animals are free range, and nobody lives past 30.
So going back to the religious exemption, while the whole crisis was happening in Philadelphia, as you're trying to reason with parents who are not open to reasoning and medical science facts, did you ever hit them up with this argument that God created man, who therefore invented the vaccine? So would that sway them?
Yeah, so you could make the argument that let's say God created man in His image. That image, it must have included a brain, and it's the Galileo line is, which I love, which is, I can't believe that the same guy, this was stated as he was being carted away and put in jail for believing that the Earth wasn't the center of the firmament. But he said, I can't believe the same God that granted us sense, reason, and intellect also intended us to forgo their use. I think you could argue if you're making that argument that we're God made, that we've created things that make our lives better, safer. And also it is if you're going to do that, then do it all the way. Don't use glasses, don't use pasteurization, don't use refrigeration, don't use any of the other modern conveniences that are also the product of science.
You say that you are fine with the fear, that you understand the fears that people have of vaccinations. Explain that.
Yes. Well, first of all, if you're the parent of a newborn, first of all, you watch them get the hepatitis B vaccine within hours of birth. It's a violent act. You pin the child down against their will. You inject this. You have this needle in which you either subcutaneous or in the muscle inject a biological fluid. And in the case of a 2-month-old or 4-month-old or 6-month-old, it could be 5 shots. That's more than you have limbs. So I understand how there is a revulsion. I get that, and I think, and so that's okay. But I think when people are afraid of a specific thing, like autism or multiple sclerosis, there are data to answer that question. So I think it's perfectly reasonable to be afraid. I think it's perfectly reasonable to be skeptical of anything you put in your body, anything. Including the GNC Center, by the way, in that, which interestingly is an unregulated industry as distinct from vaccines. But but don't be cynical. Don't cross the line into cynicism, where you just choose not to believe the reams of data that have been generated to answer your question. I think that's different. That's frustrating.
If I am a parent and I make sure that my children have all their vaccines, everything is up to date, and they are in a class with 2 or 3 kids who have not had any vaccines, do I have anything to worry about?
Well, yes, because even if everybody in the classroom was vaccinated, children don't only spend their time in the classroom, number one. Number two is, like all medicines, nothing is 100% effective. Vaccines are no different. The measles vaccine, for example, or measles-containing vaccine is about 95% effective at preventing illness. Well, so 5 out of every 100 children, although they've gotten the vaccine, won't be protected. So, which is often the argument an anti-vaccine person will make, is that don't worry about me. You just worry about yourself, and you've been vaccinated, you're fine. That's not true. And measles is an excellent vaccine. Some vaccines aren't as good. The influenza vaccine is about 60% effective at preventing medically attended influenza-like illness. The pertussis or whooping cough vaccine, although the best tool we have, has a pretty rapid fading of immunity. So, vaccines aren't perfect. They're the best tool we have, but they certainly don't provide any sort of Star Wars-like, 100% protection. That never happens.
What is your opinion concerning pediatricians who refuse to see unvaccinated children?
Well, one of them is my wife, so I guess I have a high opinion of her. I think pediatricians are in an impossible situation. I mean, in the end, you're the child's advocate. You want to try and make sure the child's in the safest position possible, which I would argue means getting vaccines. But the question is, what's the best way to do that? You could argue that if you say simply, I'm not going to see you, then what happens? So they just go to a pediatrician who's perfectly willing not to vaccinate them, or a chiropractor who won't vaccinate them. What's the best way to convince people? And I guess just watching my wife go through my N of 1 experience while watching her, she used to just do the best she could. She would just try and convince people, and she felt she was about 25% effective at convincing those who didn't want any vaccines to at least get some vaccines. But then she'd had it. First of all, there is a responsibility to your waiting room. I think the more children that are in your waiting room that aren't vaccinated does put those others at risk. And there are some kids, for example, who can't be vaccinated because they're getting chemotherapies for their cancer, or immune suppressive therapies for rheumatologic diseases, or they're getting steroids for their asthma. And there's about 500,000 people in the U.S. of the 300 million people who can't be vaccinated. So they depend on those around them to vaccinate. She found once she drew the line that she was actually more successful, because she found that people saw how important it was to her. Because when you continue to see people who aren't vaccinated, at some level, tacitly, you're agreeing that it's okay. And by drawing the line to, this is that important to me. I mean, let me love your child. Don't put me in a position of practicing substandard care. I can't do it. I see children suffer this, and I can't do it. Don't make me do it. And with that, she's much more convincing. She thinks she's up to about 90% with this being much more sort of passionate and prescriptive, which is not the way medical students are taught these days. I mean, and I'm not criticizing this. I'm just saying this is what happens when you get old, right? In our day, no, you're taught, and it's good to be much more open-minded to all different sort of attitudes and cultural beliefs, and that's great to a point. But this is that point. It's okay to say, don't do this. This is a bad idea, and have in your head those kids who do suffer these diseases as a way to propel you forward.
In this state, the Pennsylvania Department of Health data, there's all sorts of data that comes out of the department, and it was some data was recently analyzed by our content partner at WESA, an entity called Public Source, which I would recommend checking out because they do great investigative journalism. They discovered that at the start of this school year, data showed that in the past 8 years, measles vaccination rates for kindergartners in most Pennsylvania counties never reached the key threshold, the point at which disease is unlikely to spread. How much does that concern you?
Well, so just to back up a second, it's the percentage of people that need to be vaccinated depends on the contagiousness of the disease. So when you start to see a fraying of herd immunity, which is what we're starting to see now, what you see is what you'd expect to see, which is the most contagious diseases come back first. Measles, mumps, whooping cough. You would have to have a greater drop in the percentage of kids immunized to start to see other diseases come back, like, say, diphtheria or polio. I mean, we really put a major dent in polio. By the time we got to 40% immunization rates, by 70%, we'd come close to eliminating the disease. So it depends on the contagiousness of the disease. Measles is the most contagious of at least the vaccine-preventable diseases. So when you get any fraying, that's when you see it come out. So what do I think? I mean, I think, we need to do better. And, I guess, independent of the anti-vaccine movement, or at least the professional anti-vaccine movement people, I think what you're seeing, frankly, is just the natural history of an immunization program. You didn't have to convince my parents to be vaccinated, didn't have to convince me to vaccinate my children. But once you start to, the diseases, start to drop, people don't fear them anymore, and they're not going to fear them until they come back. I think, that sadly, even though we've had a vaccine education center at Children's Hospital Philadelphia for 15 years, nothing educated better than measles virus in that 2015 outbreak and all the media attention that came with it. That was the great educator. It's sad that it came to that. As always, it's the most vulnerable among us who suffer our ignorance, in this case, children. But sadly, I think that's it. Don mentioned Maurice Hilleman, who is the inventor of the measles vaccine and the mumps vaccine, the first rubella vaccine. I asked him in the last sort of 6 months of his life, what did he think about all this? I mean, did he think there was this anti-vaccine sentiment, these outbreaks? Was there any way we could convince people without children having to suffer outbreaks? And he thought about that very long and hard and looked back at me and said, no, I think children are going to have to suffer again. And then he sort of looked away from me and looked outside. It was a January, wintry day. It was a very sad moment for this man who invented really 9 of the 14 vaccines we currently give to infants and young children. And no one knows his name. But everybody knows Jenny McCarthy's name, so we're good.
We have people that want to ask questions, and Jill is back there with a microphone, and there's a gentleman right back there who has a question.
Paul, you've been such an enormously positive influence on vaccination and developing vaccines, but I think the point you made just in your last comment was really important, and the issue of education and health literacy is critical. Are you going to be trying to move any of this into the obstetrical offices, so in fact that you're able to educate and work with parents before they're in that critical moment when somebody's coming at their child with a needle?
Yeah, yes. I think even before that, we're fortunate enough to get a $1.9 million grant to create a series of educational modules for elementary school, junior high school, and high school students. I mean, these are future parents. So I think, what's the education that kids get about vaccines in elementary school or junior high school or high school? Pretty much that they hurt. I think that's their perception of vaccines. So I think that's one area. And we actually also, with that money, created a movie about Marie Silliman, which educates about vaccines. So I'm sure it'll be picked up by the Tribeca Film Festival, so it'll be good.
Speaking of which, there is, of course, the white-hot controversy over the film Vaxxed, which has just been pulled by Robert De Niro from the Tribeca Film Festival. Vaxxed, for those who are not aware, directed by the polarizing anti-vaccine activist Andrew Wakefield. He's a former British gastroenterologist and medical researcher known for his fraudulent 1998 research paper in support of the now discredited claim that there was a link between the administration of the measles, mumps, and rubella MMR vaccine and the appearance of autism and bowel disease. De Niro was going to allow this film to be shown, then he pulled it. What exactly happened that led to De Niro's change of heart? What can you tell us about that?
I'm just subject to the same rumor as everybody else is. I mean, he clearly had chosen to put that in the film festival by his choice. In other words, it wasn't necessarily the selection committee that did that. He sort of pulled that out and said, I want this in there. So I'm not sure the selection committee actually ever selected it. The rumor is that there was a celebrity that wanted him to do it. The celebrity was Leonardo DiCaprio. That's the rumor that's out there. May or may not be true. There were a lot of people who then, when he made that choice, and the reason that he gave was he said, I just want this to be part of the discussion. What to be part of the discussion? That MMR vaccine causes autism? I mean, there are 15 studies that show that MMR vaccine doesn't cause autism. And so this sort of supposed, whistleblower for the CDC who's saying that data were misrepresented, even if you assume that's true, and it's not, even if you assume that's true, how about the other 14 studies? I mean, were those all sort of part of some major conspiracy as well? So it was all nonsense. It wouldn't have advanced the discussion at all, any more than having a creationist would advance the discussion about evolution. It doesn't advance the discussion. So for whatever reason, and there are a lot of people that are taking credit for changing his mind because success has many fathers. I just got an email from somebody who claimed credit for it today. But that he did choose, he never saw it, interestingly. When he finally saw it, then he, at least with the other support from the scientific community, then to his credit, decided to withdraw it. That's great. I mean, it's not easy to say that you were wrong, but he did. So good. Great. Now, the movie is going to be showing in New York City at the Angelica movie theater on Friday. So because the movie filmmakers are trying to take advantage of this. They were picked up by a distributor, but it's really a distributor that doesn't have much clout. So I don't think this movie is going to get any clout. And it's sort of boring. I mean, it's kind of an inside baseball-ish kind of movie about the CDC whistleblower, who, by the way, never appears in this film. It's just, it's just his voice. You hear his voice over the phone. So he's a whistleblower who's never blown a whistle. I mean, if you're going to be a whistleblower, let's hear it. I mean, typically a whistleblower is like, I work for an auto manufacturer. They've known this part was bad. They known they was going to make your car explode. Then the car's exploded. Then you step forward and you're protected. They can't fire you to say that they knew this all along. He's claiming that there was a misrepresentation of data associated with a 2004 CDC paper, the first author of whom was Frank DeStefano, he claimed that if you look at a subset of children at a around 36 months of age there were African American, which is ironic considering his initial paper had nothing to do with African American children, but that this group of African American children had a statistically significant greater risk of autism if they'd received MMR vaccine, which was true. But the reason that this never made it into the paper was why it was true. The reason is that the African American community was less likely to be vaccinated than the Caucasian community. But if you were diagnosed with autism, you couldn't qualify for services unless you were vaccinated. So it's not that MMR had caused autism, it's that the diagnosis of autism caused you to get an MMR vaccine, which is why it was never in the paper, because it was never anything to talk about. But William Thompson, for whatever reason, the whistleblower has a problem with this, but he's never said anything. You only hear other people talking for him. Stand up and say what the problem is, because the information that he submitted to Congress, and I actually have to go speak to someone in Congress tomorrow afternoon about this investigation, it just shows the kind of typical discussions that one has when evaluating data and trying to decide how to present it. It's nothing. There's nothing there. But Andrew Wakefield simply can't be wrong, and so now he's become a film director.
And so how... Yeah, don't all of you, rush right out to New York tomorrow to go see it. How much damage has been done by someone like Andrew Wakefield spreading misinformation? Can you assess that?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, he sure. That when that paper was published, to defend the media in any sense, the paper was published in the Lancet. I mean, that's the oldest of the general medical journals. I think it's assumed by the media that there must have been some vetting of this paper, and so they ran with it. Now suddenly we have a man bites dog story. MMR, what was thought to be a life-saving vaccine, actually was causing autism. So thousands of parents actually chose not to vaccinate. There were hundreds of hospitalizations. There were 4 children who died. That's what happened. So you could argue that paper killed 4 children. You could make that argument. Here, and this was a paper by Michael Smith and Lou Bell and others in the United States, Susan Ellenberg, showed that parents of at least 125,000 children chose not to vaccinate them with the measles-containing vaccine because of that paper. And remember, we eliminated measles in this country in 2000, but it's come back, I think, in large part because people have a fear of that vaccine, and it's very hard to unscare people. I think once you've scared them, it's hard to unscare them, and that's what's happened here. So, yes, I think it did harm. I think a lot of people have dirty hands in this. Wakefield is one. He's an attractive man. He's well spoken. He has a British accent. We're perfectly willing to give ourselves back to the Queen at this point, which, frankly, given current elections, I'm not opposed to.
We have some folks that have questions back there. And hi, just tell us your
Hi.
name and go ahead.
My name is Jasmine Herrera. I'm an MPH MSW student, and my question is, in our conversation, we heard, in your presentation, we heard a lot about pressures that existed to make certain actions happen with vaccinations, and also the time periods when symptoms started showing for these illnesses show up faster. My question is your perspective on HPV vaccinations and the fact that, sometimes symptoms don't show up for many, many years, and all those.
That's a great question. I think when the hepatitis B vaccine came out in the early initially in the 80s, and then it was routine newborn recommendation in the early 90s, people weren't very compelled by it. I think because generally pediatricians are the big givers of vaccines, and they usually didn't see the complications of hepatitis B, which were cirrhosis or liver cancer, which came later in life. Although they did see certainly overwhelming hepatitis B, and eventually, we have excellent immunization rates on hepatitis B, and we've basically eliminated that disease in the U.S. in the less than 19-year-old. HPV suffers the same problem. I mean, most people that give the pediatricians that give HPV vaccine don't see the head and neck cancers, the anal and genital cancers, the cervical cancers that occur 20 or 25 years later. So they tend to be less compelled by it. And it's our most embarrassing vaccine. I mean, if you have to say what vaccine is going to prevent the most deaths in this country in kids who will eventually become adults every year, it's HPV. I mean, the HPV-9 vaccine, the new vaccine, which is about a year old, will prevent about 30,000 cases of cancer and roughly 5,000 deaths a year. That's an impactful vaccine, yet only 40% of girls finish the series. Only about 15% of boys finish the series. And I think I think I lay the blame at the feet of the physicians, who are very mild about recommending this vaccine. It's like, today you're getting a Tdap vaccine, today you're getting a meningococcal vaccine, and we have the HPV vaccine if you want. I have had friends email me one this morning saying that, she wanted to get the HPV vaccine and the doctor talked her out of it. You can get it up to the age of 26. You're not sexually active yet. It's a preventive vaccine. It's a prophylactic vaccine. I mean, when I was on the ACIP when they were presenting these data, and what percentage 15-year-olds have what the CDC euphemistically calls sexual debut? Thank you. You've been a wonderful audience. I'll be here all week. It was about 25%. I mean, it's high, not our kids, of course, but other people's kids. But that's it's only a preventive vaccine. It's just ridiculous that we don't give this vaccine. And I think I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that they titled "Let's Not Talk About Sex," and I think that's what the thing is. It's a cancer-preventing vaccine. We don't have to talk about how it's transmitted. We don't talk about how other diseases are transmitted. Why don't we just give this as a cancer-preventing vaccine? And it's funny, when my daughter was in the 8th grade, I had to speak to her class, her biology class, about vaccines. Most harrowing talk I've ever given in my life, actually. But I also spoke to the 12th graders. This was 2006. It was right around the time the vaccine came out, actually. She was an 8th grader. So I asked the senior girls, she was an all-girls school, I asked the senior girls there, what percentage of you have gotten the HPV vaccine? This is 2006, and half of them said that they'd gotten it. And I asked the other half why they didn't get it, and they all had the same answer. My father didn't want me to get it. Right? You don't want to think your little girl's ever going to have sex. And, I get this. I mean, my daughter's now 21. But when she was 5, I said to her she could date whoever she wanted, whenever she wanted. She just had to wait till 3 days after I was dead. So I get that. And still she dates people. She says, I was only 5. Hey, a deal's a deal.
We have another question back there. Go ahead. Who are you? And
hi, I'm
what's your
Vicki
question?
Jewell. I'm a community pediatrician. We found that anecdotal reports make a difference in people's minds about things, and we try and confront that with science, and it doesn't have the same impact. So how do we change the conversation so that we present more anecdotes that make the difference without being fearmongers?
That's a great question. And so I'll give you an example. My wife, is in pediatrics, was helping the nurse give vaccines one day. So there was a 4-month-old sitting on her mother's lap, and while she was drawing the vaccine up into the syringe, the 4-month-old had a seizure. She hadn't given it yet, right? And then went on to have a permanent seizure disorder and actually died of a chronic neurological disease by the time she was 5. It's a true story. If she had given that vaccine 5 minutes earlier, I don't think there are any amount of statistical data in the world that would have convinced that mother of anything other than the vaccine caused it. What, do you think I'm stupid? My child comes in here, is fine, gets a vaccine, 5 minutes later has a seizure, goes on to have these neurological problems. I know what I saw. That's what you're up against. You're up against very powerful, emotional, anecdotal stories. That's Jenny McCarthy's story, right? My child was fine, got a vaccine, then the soul left his eyes. When you're trying to confront that with data that, say, in this case, showed that the particular vaccine doesn't cause seizures, doesn't cause chronic neurological diseases. And so I think what you have to do is you can never leave the science. I mean, the science is all we have, frankly, to separate, from reason from fear. I mean, it's that thin blue line that separates those two things. You can never leave the science, but I think you have to frame it in an emotional way, in a passionate way, in a compassionate way that also is filled with stories that, a choice not to get a vaccine is not a risk-free choice. It's a choice to take a different and more serious risk. This is what that risk looks like. I mean, there's not a year goes by we don't see these diseases in our hospital. And so those are in your head, and that's what you have to try and combat it with. But you're right. It's hard. It's how we're wired. We're really wired that way. We're humans. We're compelled by story, certainly far more than numbers.
Thank you very much. We have a gentleman back there. If a gentleman here is raising his hand, if you want to ask a question, I think the best thing to do would be to go back there where the microphone is and get in a nice orderly line back there, and we'll take as many questions as we can. You, sir.
My name's Todd Willen. I'm a pediatrician. I actually use that story after I've heard you tell it several times. It's been helpful. The other thing is just telling people that I wouldn't do anything different for you than I would do for my own child. But my question's about what's going on with Pennsylvania and the exemptions right now. Are you aware of any moves, and can you update us on that?
Yeah, there's a congressman in Pennsylvania, Dalen Leach, who's trying to introduce a bill to overturn the philosophical exemption. I think that has no chance of succeeding in our state, and I'll tell you why.
Why is that?
I'll tell you why. Thank you. when the when Jerry Sandusky, for example, had the pedophilia scandal in Penn State, that was a real opportunity to try and tighten child abuse and neglect laws, and so we tried. I mean, at that time, we tried to overturn what is our states or commonwealths. We have a commonwealth law that has a religious exemption to child abuse and neglect laws. Right? So a contradiction in terms when it serves, right? Religious exemption to child abuse and neglect. Wait, child abuse and neglect is religious. And so that's our state. I mean, we are a state founded on individual rights and freedoms, especially religious freedoms. And I think it's that sort of don't tell me how to raise my family. Certainly don't tell me how to practice my religion. I just don't think there's any chance in our state that's going to happen. But I hope I'm wrong. I would have given, frankly, SB 277 no chance in California. But I was wrong. And that's because of the strength and conviction of Richard Pan. Wow, what a hero. I mean, and Dalen Leach is trying. I give him credit for trying. I'd be surprised, pleasantly, but surprised.
Dalen Leach is the guy who was really making the first big push in the legislature for medical marijuana. And a few years back when he was doing that, people couldn't envision that it's just about passed. It's kind of hung up in the legislature now. But based on that, maybe it will come to fruition. We have another gentleman back there.
Hi, Scott Pappert, Epidemiology. I have two quick questions for you. This week, The Economist is running an article about vaccinations, and they say that aside from what's happened in California the past couple of years, that the anti-vaxxer population is roughly staying stable, 1% to 2%, maybe as high as 5%. But globally, that there is an alarming trend about health providers, particularly doctors and nurses, taking liberties with the scheduling. Could you speak to then what your thoughts are about the flexibility of the scheduling? You spoke to some difficulties with and parents' concerns about how many vaccines they get in a year, or just being stabbed, their kid being stabbed at that.
We as I said earlier, we give more vaccines in this country than in terms of both number and frequency than any other country. It's true, because we can, and because we should prevent diseases whenever we can. We should prevent suffering and hospitalization and death whenever we can. But it's a busy schedule. I mean, there's no doubt about it, and it's very easy to appeal to the notion that it's too much, that there's too many vaccines given too soon, that they should be sort of spaced out and separated. And that's the popularity of Robert Sears' book, The Vaccine Book, Making the Right Decision for Your Child, at the back of which is Dr. Bob's alternative vaccine schedule. I mean, I think he hit on something, which is to say this kind of middle ground. Let's just delay them a little bit so they don't get more than 2 adjuvant-containing vaccines at the same schedule. So it's not science-based. It's a terrible idea. All it does is it should be called what it is. I mean, I give him credit for using the term alternative. There is no alternative. There's an alternative rabies vaccine schedule. There's not an alternative vaccine schedule. But the word alternative is a good word, right? Alternative music, alternative energy. I mean, it's called what it is. It's a delayed vaccine schedule, which is to say you now have an increased period of time during which you're susceptible to these diseases for no benefit. But I think doctors are worn down by this. I mean, you're watching my wife in this. I mean, you just get worn down by this. You can't have this conversation every time the patient comes in the room. And at some level, you're willing to say, okay, let's just do the best we can, and I'll see you next time. I have sympathy for physicians in this position. I do.
But you believe that the schedule should be as rigid or similarly as rigid as what it is now?
Do I think the schedule should be
as rigid as
the schedule? Let me put it this. When you put a vaccine onto the schedule, you have to do concomitant use studies, which is to say you have to show that your vaccine doesn't interfere with the safety or immunogenicity profile of existing vaccines and vice versa. There are probably 800 concomitant use studies, not all of which are published, but they're out there. They have to be. The FDA will not license a vaccine unless you prove that, and that gets it onto the schedule in that manner. When you make up your own schedule, you are treading into unknown waters. You don't know what the safety and immunogenicity is anymore, giving it your way. So that's why it is the way it is, and children certainly can handle it. I mean, when you're born, you enter a world where you're colonized with 100 trillion bacteria, to which you make an immune response. You're bombarded with antigens far greater than you ever get in vaccines.
So the other quick question I have is about the role of climate change and emergent diseases. Do you see a reemergence of zoonotic diseases as infectious diseases? As a result
I
of
think
climate
Don Burke is the person to ask that question to.
We have another person back there. Hi.
Hi, I'm Troy Lyons. I'm a pediatrician and an MPH candidate. I thought that was an awesome and wonderful talk. I wanted to say that first. My question is really, how do you deal with social media and your parents and vaccination? I feel like they have more weight with vaccination than me as a physician.
Yeah, there are. I'm an old person, so I'm terrible at social media. I do have a Twitter account, which I can never remember. My daughter reminds. She's the one who set it up. She reminds me what it is. And I have a Facebook page. But our center has chosen not to do this. The Vaccine Education Center doesn't do this because it's not how we wanted to spend our time. But there are groups like Immunization Action Coalition, Every Child by Two, which do sort of intersect at social media in both the Twitter world and the Facebook world. And so I think there are groups out there that are getting up to speed on this. So I'm optimistic.
Paul, I'm wondering how you got to the point where you were able to. It's not easy to do what you do, to take on the vaccine deniers. It puts you in harm's way. When did it get personal for you, or when did you get to the point where you said, "I've got to step out and be proactive about this and lead the fight"?
I think for me, I'm a bad sport. Okay, that's basically what it boils down to. I mean, I worked for 26 years on the development of rotavirus, so I saw how hard it was to do that. We had the strains in our lab by the late 80s that we thought could be this vaccine. Then we did a series of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials. And the phase 3 trial was a prospective, placebo-controlled, 70,000 person plus, 11 country, $350 million trial to prove that the vaccine was what it was claimed to be. And then the Wakefield paper comes out, which just basically says, here's 8 kids who have autism within a month of receiving vaccine, and that's enough, right? I mean, that's good enough. So it upset me that how easy it was to damn vaccines, number one. Number two is, this is probably not going to be popular, but I think the American Academy of Pediatrics, who I love, obviously, I'm a member of the I'm a fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics, but I think that when these issues were coming up, at least in the early 2000s, the way they dealt with it was to put out pediatricians who really didn't know the specific scientific issue that was being raised. So what they would sort of be, they would be calming, don't worry, vaccines have been well tested, these diseases are bad, let's keep vaccinating. But no one really addressed the specific issue of why it is that what Andrew Wakefield said didn't make a bit of biological sense, for example. I mean, his claim, for example, that the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine overwhelmed the immune system because it was combined was fanciful and testable, and he never tested it. I mean, you can determine whether or not a child's immune system is suppressed after you give them 3 vaccines together than separately. Never done. Then he said because your immune system is suppressed, the vaccine virus goes to the intestine and reproduces itself, for which he had no evidence. Then the vaccine virus, because it reproduces itself at the intestinal mucosal surface, is causing this ingress of brain-damaging proteins, which he never identified, that then traveled then crossed an intact blood-brain barrier, causing autism, for which he had not one shred of evidence. I just wanted scientists to stand up there and say, here's why this science doesn't make any sense. Just attack the issue head on, and that's why they hate me. Because, I think I was willing to do that instead of just being sort of placating. And also, there's the good reasons and the bad reasons I do this. I'll give you the good reasons first. The good reasons is I don't like it that children have to suffer this. I don't. They suffer bad information, which causes them to suffer and occasionally die from these diseases. That's unconscionable. The bad reason is I really can't stand these groups. They're like these personal injury lawyer backed, media savvy, politically active, angry parents groups who are like an industry. I mean, if you look at their websites, they're supported by personal injury lawyers. They're often on their sites, they have the cures for autism from the dietary supplement industry. It's an anti-child industry is what it is. And I think people needed to stand up and say that. So people do, but that's what motivated me to do it. Hatred and anger. I think they're evil and they must be defeated.
Kind of reminds me of the Hulk. You wouldn't like me when I'm angry. Sir, go ahead.
Bill Coppola, general pediatrician. And I appreciate your talk, and I was interested in that point you made about IPV, OPV, oral polio, and tying it into sort of the medical community and the CDC getting our act together as quickly as we can. I mean, that's a good example of one where there was a problem. People did see it. I mean, we were trying to fudge around it a little bit to get, because the only cases of polio were from the oral. but it was still the recommended schedule. It was still the schedule that we were supposed to stick with. And then it takes some time, and you said you're on the committee to try to get that switched over. But there's a time lag where we sort of know what's going on, but we don't get the recommendation changed. And similarly, you have states that, or like our state, offers a school-required vaccine schedule that's really very below what we would recommend that we think is the best schedule to do, trying to get that integrated together. I know that's a political question, a little bit more than a medical one, but if you could comment maybe on the polio.
Well, here's what I was saying. I mean, so there's 3 steps to vaccines. First is that data are submitted and the FDA license it, which means that you can use it. Then the groups like the CDC and the American Academy of Pediatrics recommend it, meaning this is how it should be used and in which groups. And then comes the sort of fuzzier thing, which is the sort of the mandates, and those vary state to state, they vary district to district, and are irrelevant. They're relevant. I mean, the question is it a value? Does it work in this group? Does it, here's the recommended schedule. That's the schedule. I think the rest of it gets to, it's often driven by what different states or districts can afford and really has nothing to do with whether it's a value. So some states will recommend the pertussis vaccine or require the pertussis vaccine for schooling. Others won't. It's, what I'm saying? If that's your question, I think ignore that.
Yeah, no, that's not really my question. My question is more the delay in us coming together in the medical community and being very consistent with our message, I guess. And I think that's where we are inconsistent, and parents do get a mixed message. They may not know that the CDC is recommending all these vaccines, the AAP is, but they hear what the school's recommending, the state's recommending. So it's a dilemma for parents. Again,
no, I agree with you.
We're out there.
It's not,
but also the delay in the polio issue. You said you were
You're
on
right.
the committee and pushed that. That delay creates now another area where people say, well, see, that's where a mistake is made where you keep a vaccine going, because obviously having an oral polio vaccine in your waiting room with kids who are unvaccinated and a bunch of kids getting oral polio isn't the best idea when you've eliminated polio. But it just, we have delays because of arguments within, to me, that question seemed answered. That question seemed answered maybe a year or two before the changes came out.
Yeah, so the system's imperfect. I agree. I mean, such is the nature of bureaucracy. You can argue, why was HPV-9 not the recommended vaccine? I mean, it covers the 5 additional serotypes. That's another roughly 4,000 cases of cancer. It's roughly 800 deaths. Why isn't that the preferred vaccine over HPV-4? And there's sort of, it has to do with the way that HPV-4 was licensed initially, because there were gender differences, so Merck couldn't promote it in a certain way, but the ACIP didn't make a distinction for gender, so they should have just said HPV-9 is the recommended vaccine, period. Right? That's the best vaccine. But so you're right. I think sometimes these things get confusing, and it's confusing for you. I agree.
Thank you.
Young lady in the back.
Hi, my name is Chelsea. I work for Joanne Flynn, and I'm also a part-time MPH candidate in the IDM program. My question is, there are states' rights and individual rights, but since we're a global economy and disease knows no bounds, why is there no push for a national policy, like something along with the ACA, that we can put into action so there's a standard of care across all states?
That would be great. It's sort of a government question. It's a federalist system. We have this issue of, it's an issue of states' rights. That's how it came down this way. Do I think it would be great if the federal government stepped forward and said, on the basis of the 14th Amendment, I think that we should eliminate all non-medical exemptions? That would be great. That's never going to happen. Then the Eagles will win the Super Bowl, which is also never going to happen.
As long as the Steelers do. You were here when the Steelers won their first one, right?
Two of the 3. I was here 77 and 80. I saw 2 Super Bowl wins.
So we have you to thank for that, and most importantly, for all of your fine work. And I want to thank you for being so generous with your time and taking all the questions from my questions and the audience questions. And Dr. Paul Offit, congratulations on being the recipient of the Porter Prize.